So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome for joining us. I'm Helen Close, Heritage Officer for the Women's Engineering Society. This year's Heritage Open Day Festival theme is Astounding Inventions. So we have taken the opportunity to tell the stories of 10 women inventors and innovators in 10 days. Sadly, some of the sessions have fallen by the wayside due to national events, but I'm pleased to say that Sarah Yates is joining us today to tell us about the woman who is said to have changed the course of World War II. The talk will last between 20 and 30 minutes, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. But now I'd like to hand over to Sarah for today's session of 10 Women in 10 Days. Sarah, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, lovely to see you all today. It's fantastic to be able to talk to you about Beatrice Shilling. So let me just share my slides. Okay, can everybody see that?
You see your slides, you just need to actually start the show.
Yeah, we go. Great. Okay, lovely. So yeah, my name's Sarah Yates. I'm a researcher. I've done a lot of work on the volunteer side with WES, helping with research, some of the stories of amazing women engineers. Been involved in lots of wikithons as well. I also do a lot of work with architecture in the built environment, but I'm absolutely fascinated by Beatrice Shilling's story. Just a couple of caveats though, I'm not an engineer, nor am I an expert on her life, but if you would like more information that I can't answer, we'll obviously make sure that we're sending you to the right places, and I'm sure Helen will help direct some of those sources as well. So Beatrice Shilling, Tilly was her nickname, was a remarkable woman whose invention helped Britain forces win the Second World War. She should be celebrated for this singular achievement, which I'm going to tell you about, but her whole life and career really shows how she defied convention to be one of the most remarkable engineers of her time. So Tilly was born on the 8th of March, which of course is now International Women's Day, in 1909, and she came from a relatively modest background, particularly compared to some of her contemporaries in engineering. And she was the daughter of a butcher called Henry Shilling and his wife Annie, who was also called Nancy. And you can see her on the left here. And her birthplace was a town which was kind of relatively recently formed, actually. It was called Waterlooville, named after a pub called the Heroes of Waterloo in Hampshire. And that is effectively now a suburb just north of Portsmouth that you can see in a historic map on the right here, and Waterlooville town centre you can see on the left. And actually, I come from Portsmouth myself, so it's great to talk about women who come from my native county. And Waterlooville itself, much later in history, was also associated with innovation and technology. GEC Marconi built a site for its underwater systems division for the Stingray anti-submarine torpedo in the 1980s. When Tilly was a teenager, her family moved to Surrey and she attended Dorking High School. Even at a very, very early age, her hobbies marked her out as unusual amongst her contemporaries, and probably what might have been expected of her at the time. Encouraged by a mother, as she later wrote after her retirement in 1969, as a child, I played with Meccano and spent pocket money on penknives, a glue pot, an adjustable spanner, and other such simple hand tools. When I was 16 years old, I bought a small second-hand two-stroke motorcycle. Got a lot of pleasure from dismantling and rebuilding this motorcycle, and my parents recognised that I had some mechanical skill. Now, we'll return to her interest in motorcycles a little bit later, but Meccano, as you can see here from this advert, 1920, was really targeted at the boys' market, and I think the word boy is repeated about 4 or 5 times in the advert, so she wasn't the target audience by the manufacturer's point of view, but she certainly was interested, and it was a very recent invention as well. So it's something that she was able to kind of get into and kind of develop these incredible practical skills that she had that were proved very valuable to her later career. So, as she pointed out later, she said that we did not realise it might be possible for a girl to train as an engineer until my mother learned of the Women's Engineering Society. And at that time, when Tilly was a teenager, the Women's Engineering Society was in its infancy. And the society had been founded on 23rd of June 1919 by a small committee of influential women to support women engineers who'd played a vital role in industry, as you can see from some of the photos here, during the First World War, but they were under pressure to relinquish those positions to release jobs for men returning from the war. And also importantly, very importantly for Beatrice, part of their key founding aim was to promote engineering as a rewarding job for women as well as men. And she, in fact, also later emphasised in the Women Engineer Journal the pivotal role that WES had played in encouraging her to take up engineering as a career. Without advice and help from the Women's Engineering Society, when I was trying to decide on a career during my last year at school, I do not think that I could have started in engineering in 1969. One of the people who really played an important role as a mentor, and it's something we often talk about today in women's careers as well, and also was really her kind of first employer was Margaret Partridge. And you can see Margaret Partridge on the left here. She was herself a pioneering electrical engineer, one of the founders of WES, who'd set up her own consulting business called M. Partridge & Co. And most importantly, she was also determined to help young women who were interested in engineering as a career by offering apprenticeships at her own company, specifically for young women leaving school. And she saw that Beatrice had a lot of potential, and she offered her an apprenticeship, and Beatrice was the second such apprenticeship at the age of just 17. And she moved then, of course, from Surrey to Devon to work with Margaret Partridge and her company. And she was, by all accounts, a star trainee with a hands-on approach to understanding electricity generation and distribution. Beatrice really came of age, in fact, when working with Partridge's company. One of the quote that I like that is not about engineering, that she talked about her early life and her work with Margaret Partridge was, I met many people in many walks of life, she said, and that obviously enabled her to build up a network as well and to see how, you know, the kind of client side operated too. And she said, I learned a lot of extraneous but useful things, such as how to poach a salmon. I really like that quote. And actually you can see Beatrice in the middle of the photograph on the right with another founder of WES and Margaret Partridge's partner, Margaret Rowbottom. And that's also from the Women Engineer. So Margaret Partridge really saw Beatrice's potential as a budding engineer, and she actually encouraged her very much to study the theory behind practical application, and also to apply for a degree course, which she felt was important for her in terms of building her career. So Beatrice was accepted at what is now the University of Manchester, that you can see here, and she received a bachelor's degree in 1932. Now, jobs were very hard to come by in the Depression of the 1930s. So as Beatrice had received a grant, she decided to stay on for a further year to get a Master of Science degree in mechanical engineering and appropriately doing research on internal combustion engines, which was very important for her later work, as we will see. She wasn't, female engineering students were obviously extremely few in number, but there was another woman there at the same time studying engineering, that's Sheila McGuffey. But the two women soon found that they were, as Beatrice later said, a slight embarrassment to the engineering department at times. On a boiler trial in hot weather, for example, the normal state of undress of the stokers was rapidly abandoned when it was remembered that women were present, reiterating again, of course, just how unusual her situation was at the time. So after graduation in the mid-1930s, Beatrice experienced a few dispiriting years of job searching, but in 1936 she finally found a junior position at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, or RAE, in Farnborough. And this is where she kind of really found her home, her kind of home as an engineer. And she built a distinguished career over more than 30 years until her retirement in 1969. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the RAE, but just to explain that this is the premier site for aeronautics, or was the premier site for aeronautics research in the UK. It was originally a military establishment for designing, building and testing aircraft systems, particularly through the First World War, but later became the biggest aviation research and development institution in Europe. And it was particularly famous, of course, for its wind test tunnels. And you can see an early aircraft, I think that's from about 1914 or earlier, being tested in those tunnels, in the wind tunnels. And on the right is not a particularly good photo, but it was taken in 1940, and it shows the layout of the Farnborough site. Now, Beatrice wasn't actually alone at RAE in terms of women engineering and science and women scientists. There were others who played a vital role in research at the institution, particularly in the field of aerodynamics as well. So would have been people that it just would have probably come across, even though she was in a different department. On the left is Frances Bradfield, who was a decade older than Beatrice, a mathematician who joined the RAE in 1919, and she eventually became head of the low-speed wind tunnels division in the aerodynamics department. And on the right is a German-born woman called Joanna Weber, and she was a mathematician who actually joined the same division under Bradfield after the Second World War, so quite a bit later. And she, in fact, was one of the German scientists brought to the UK at the end of World War II as part of Operation Paperclip and Operation Surgeon, which was the combined US-UK plan to acquire, inverted commas, German services and technologies for military advantage. So I'm sure you've all heard of Wernher von Braun and NASA. This was the British equivalent. And Joanna Weber was very influential in aerodynamics, particularly in the 50s and 60s, and she's best associated for her research into and with the Concorde project. But let's go back to Beatrice. Now, her first job at the RAE was a rather mundane task of writing handbooks for the technical publications department of the Air Ministry, but she soon managed to get herself transferred to the sharp end, as it were. She was promoted to technical officer in charge of carburettor research and development during the earliest days of the Second World War. And it was at this point in this department that she was handed a very serious technical problem that was preventing British Air Forces gaining superior, and particularly Spitfires and Hurricanes, you can see examples of here, gaining superiority over the Luftwaffe. And this technical problem urgently had to be solved, otherwise the battle for Britain could have taken a very different turn, perhaps even altering the course of the war. So what was the problem? And bear in mind, of course, I said I'm not an engineer, but I'll try and explain this as best I can. Essentially, when a Spitfire or Hurricane went into a dive to keep on an enemy pilot's tail, the engine would cut out. And I really love this description by Group Captain Douglas Bader, one of the RAF's top aces. And you can see him in 1940 here on the right here. And long after the war, he explained the problem in simple terms. When I push the stick forward, all the petrol goes away from the carburettor and the airplane goes puff, puff, pop, bang, just cuts out. And that was a problem that was specific to the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that these particular planes were fitted with. So essentially what was happening was when an engine performed what was described as a negative G-force maneuver, so essentially when it went, they pitched the nose hard down to go into dive, the fuel was forced up to the top of the carburetor's float chamber rather than down into the engine, leading to loss of power. And eventually what would happen was, as they pulled out of the dive, the carburetor would flood and the engine would shut down completely. So not something you really want to happen when you're in the middle of, obviously, an air battle. Just to explain the situation, there's the enemy aircraft, some of which were actually captured at the time, or had been shot down. They were used for research, and it was found that enemy aircraft were fitted with fuel injection engines, and they kept the fuel at constant pressure, so they didn't have this issue. RAF were at quite a disadvantage. So this was an incredibly complex problem to solve because there was an awful lot of variables in terms of pressure and temperature and fuel flow and so on, and obviously the angle of attack too. So the combined expertise of Rolls-Royce, the people who made the engines, was unable to solve it. But after many long hours of investigation and testing with her team, lots of hours in the lab, spending 18, 19 hours a day looking at this problem, Beatrice came up with a simple invention in early 1941. And this was known officially as the RAE restrictor. And originally it was a thimble-shaped brass flow restrictor, and that later became a flat washer. You can see an example of that on the right, which is now at Farnborough. And that was shaped precisely enough to be able to be fitted to the engine and to allow just enough fuel flow for maximum engine power and to stop the engine flooding and therefore cutting out. It was incredibly popular at the time with pilots. It could be fitted very easily, and it was a great success, and was taken up. Obviously, there were continuous innovations happening, but this was a very, very important solution. Revealing the attitudes of the time that Beatrice was facing throughout her career, it required a notorious nickname, which was Miss Shilling's orifice. And it's been suggested that that description might have been coined, among others, by the mathematician and jet engine pioneer Sir Stanley Hooker. And he was actually in charge of supercharger development of Rolls-Royce. So the suggestion has been made that he was incredibly annoyed that he was beaten to this solution by a woman. And actually on the left here, you can see an example of one of the Merlin engines. And as I mentioned, what was really vital to the success at the time was, this was an incredibly urgent solution. They couldn't take all the Spitfires and Hurricanes out of action. There just wasn't the opportunity to do that. So they had to make sure that it was something that could be adapted on the spot. And vital to its success, as I mentioned, was it could be fitted in the aeroplane without removing the engine or even the carburetor. And this was such an important task that Beatrice herself delivered restrictors to RAF sites like this one, which is RAF Bovingdon in Hertfordshire, and this photograph was taken in the Second World War. And she went out on her reliable Norton motorbike around the country to make sure that she was literally kind of delivering these things in person and making sure that they were fitted properly. So she was very involved in that process of making sure the restrictors worked. So she continued to be involved throughout the war in research, and she remained there, as I said, until 1969. She was appointed OBE in 1948, and she also has a doctorate from the University of Surrey. And as we entered the period of the Cold War, she worked on some of the most significant aviation and defence research projects of the time, including, as you can see on the right here, was the Blue Streak missile project. And that was a British research project which was never put into full production for an intermediate range ballistic missile to maintain an independent British nuclear deterrent. And you can see an example of one of the test sites here. And on the left is her part of her application to the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, which she did in 1956, and she was elected an associate member. And actually, unfortunately, what you can't see in the photo is the application mentions specifically her work on developing the RAE restrictor in her application for membership. If you look carefully, and hopefully you can see this okay, if you look in the middle of the application, you'll see that she has a different name, and that's Mrs. Beatrice Naylor, because before the war, in the late 1930s, she'd met her husband, George Naylor. Apparently he was over 6 foot tall compared to her 5 foot 1 inches. And he was a mathematician in the mechanical test department. During the war, he became a bomber pilot and was awarded the Distinguished Flying. Now, Beatrice and George were quite the couple, and one of the things that they really shared as an interest was in racing motorbikes and cars. As I mentioned earlier, Beatrice had taken up motorcycle racing in the mid-1930s after graduating from university, and she bought a Norton motorbike on which she actually beat professional male riders, and she was famously awarded the Gold Star Award for lapping the circuit at Brooklands in Surrey at 106 miles per hour on her bike in 1934. And you can, so it's not a very good photo, but on the left you can see the famous banking of the racing circuit at Brooklands, which I can tell you, having been there, it's much steeper than it looks. So it's quite a scary thing to do. And obviously 100 miles an hour in the 1930s was incredibly fast. And I think she was actually the second woman to get that famous accolade. And one of the things that people do know quite often about Beatrice is that she only agreed to marry George, it said, after he himself had won that same coveted Gold Star Award for riders achieving the incredible speed of 100 miles an hour. And he did that in 1938, so for 4 years after her. And they got married in that year. So after the war, in particular, they continued their love of racing, but especially in cars. And they modified cars extensively in their home workshop. And I think their first car was a Lagonda Rapier. And this isn't their actual car, but this is an example of a 1934, a 1930s Lagonda Rapier, and later other makes of vehicle as well. And there's now kind of more books and articles that have been written about Beatrice, and a lot of them have suggested that she was happiest when she was tinkering with engines well into her retirement. And her great niece, Beatrice and George didn't have any children, but her great niece Jo Denbury remembers her well, and I think she was interviewed quite recently for her memories of Beatrice. And she said, I suppose my earliest memory of her was probably going to her house. I think she was about 60. You'd go in through the side because the sitting room was turned into a kind of mechanic's workshop. I always remember the smell, which was the smell of oil. So very distinctive. Now, Beatrice had quite a long life. She died at the age of 81 in 1990, but I think it's really only in the past decade that her amazing life and career have become better known. And we've started to see, as I said, there's been books written about her, but there's also now kind of physical kind of commemoration at the places at which she was associated with. There's now 2 university buildings named after her, one at Royal Holloway University and the other at Coventry University, and the latter was opened in 2020. You can see that one on the right. You can now also visit Beatrice Shilling Wetherspoons pub in Farnborough. And there's also a Blue Heritage plaque in Farnborough, unveiled and instituted by the Farnborough Society outside her house in Ashley Road, where she once lived while working for the RAE. There's also now a memorial plaque. I think it's at Waterlooville Library, so there's actually one in her birthplace as well. So it's fantastic to be able to share this story of this remarkable woman engineer and the inventions that really did effectively change the course of history, we could say, in the 20th century. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I'm okay on time, Helen.
Yes, you're
Tell
fine.
me if I am.
Yes.
And I'm sure Helen will say a bit more about this, but there's lots of other fantastic stories of historic women engineers being profiled in Wes's participation in Heritage Open Days. Make sure you follow us on social media, particularly Twitter and Instagram, and have a look at the website to see what's happening later this week. And I, for one, I'm really excited by hearing some of the other talks. So I hope that's given you a picture of Beatrice and encourages you to learn more about her and her inventions.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. And you've done a wonderful sales pitch there, so there's not really much more for me to say. Yes, we've got the next.
I stopped sharing. Sorry.
Okay,
yeah,
that's fine.
Okay.
Over the next few days, we are having some more talks going on. So tomorrow evening, if you can get there, I am down in Gillingham in Kent talking about Verena Holmes. On Wednesday, we have Dr. Nina Baker talking about Hilda Lyon and the aeronautical design. And then on Thursday, I am down in Street in Somerset doing a kind of overview of lots of women engineers, so 10 women engineers. And then on Friday, we will be joined by Gail Hewlett, Hilda Hewlett's granddaughter-in-law and author, about the life of Hilda Hewlett. And then on Saturday, I am going up to Rotherham to the Chapel on the Bridge to see the little exhibition they've got there as part of Heritage Open Days on Monica Maurice, who is another one of our fantastic engineers, and I'll be available to talk to people there as well. So I'll throw the opportunity open if anybody has got any questions for Sarah or myself about the Women Engineering Society, or about anything. If people want to take their mics off mute, that would be great. And if you want to show your faces as well, you can turn your cameras off as well, cameras on. You should be able to do that. So please do that if you want to. And has anybody got any questions? You can pop them in the chat if you don't want to actually turn your mics off. On, even. Got my ons and offs going the wrong way today. So I wonder if I can turn everybody. Ask to unmute. Ask to unmute. Ask to unmute. I might be able to turn people's. No, we've got nobody. Oh, right, I'm taking.
Hello.
Hello, Jackie. Hi.
Jackie from Hampshire. Something that we've got in Hampshire in Farnborough is a women's institute, the Tilly Widgets.
Oh, right, okay.
Which is named after her.
That's a fab name. Tilly Widgets. So that's your WI group, yes?
Yeah, it's not my WI group, but there is a WI in Farnborough that's Tilly Widgets.
Oh, well, that's nice to know.
That's such a great name. I wish I thought of that. We must look that up.
Yeah, and see whether they've got any more knowledge about Tilly's life. Has anybody else got any comments they'd like to make? I'm trying to turn people's microphones off here, but I'm not having much luck. Anybody got any questions? You can put them in the chat if you want to. I can hear some heavy breathing. That's Hemant breathing down the microphone there. I'm just trying to. I'm asking people to unmute, so perhaps people don't want to. Perhaps people are happy not saying anything to us, which is a shame. There's no more questions. I'm just trying to think if I've got one for you, Sarah. Obviously, we know that there were a lot of new women engineers coming to the forefront at the same period of time that Tilly was. What do you think drove some of these women to push forward in the way that they did? And what contribution do you think that the Women's Engineering Society played in that?
I think with Tilly, I think she was such obviously quite an unusual character in terms of she had that ambition from a very early age, and she was very clear about what she wanted to do. And it was actually only when she wrote there's a really fantastic article that some of the quotes came from that she wrote in the Women Engineers, so that she was a member of WES. And she wrote this very interesting article looking back at her early career in the 1920s in this article when she retired in 1969. And at that point, she obviously was very eminent. She was, I think, principal scientific officer or above that level at Farnborough. So she was then seen as a role model herself, but it was very clear. Well, firstly, she was encouraged by her mother. So that was quite interesting. I don't think we know too much about her, but when she was, they found out that, you know, WES existed, and it was still very new at that point. And then they kind of were introduced to Margaret Partridge and Caroline Hasler as well, I think she mentions. So I think that was the role of WES, you know, it did kind of, it's got really interesting parallels today, I think, you know, with finding talent as, you know, human resources people would tell us, you know, and really supporting women. And she came through the apprenticeship route. So she came from a relatively modest background. She didn't go to university straight away. She went through the apprenticeship route first, and then they said, okay, well, you actually need to kind of do a degree because you're capable of doing that. So in terms of her personal motivations, it was just obviously really clear to her from the earliest part of her life this was the path she wanted to go. And that meeting WES kind of gave her the kind of ability or the kind of mentoring and support to actually achieve that goal. You mentioned obviously Monica, and you know, you and I have spoken about Monica lots of times, and Monica Maurice I've also done research on. She's fascinating as well. And again, she came from a slightly different route because her family firm was involved in engineering, in creating mining lamps and manufacturing, but she took on that responsibility. So I think it's really interesting in terms of looking at women's backgrounds and motivations, that, you know, the fact that WES was there, it did give them that route into engineering, but it's quite hard to understand, you know, sometimes what their particular
driving forces
were. But obviously with Tilly, you know, she was from a really early age, she knew what she wanted to do. Like, that's why I love that advert about Meccano, you know, it's got the word boys all over it. But she thought, okay, this is great, this is really relevant to me, and I'm going to make sure I make the best use of it. And I bought a motorbike as well. So I don't think many women age 16 bought a motorbike in the early years.
Yeah, it's something Verena Holmes did as well. So she bought a stroke
so they
too.
shared
So
they shared that ambition as well.
Fast cars, motorbikes and aeroplanes, all of them.
Exactly. You know, we of course, Amy Johnson. Well, Monica flew as well. She loved driving fast cars. She was part of the Yorkshire Air Club, and you know, they had those kind of interests in common, and it gave them that support to know that there were other women who had those interests that might have been seen as very unusual at the time by other people.
Okay, thank you. Has anybody else got any questions? I've got some, Helen's saying no questions there. I know, Janet, you've taken your mic off mute. I don't know whether you want to say anything.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Janet. Lovely to hear you.
Yeah, I just feel so blasted sick compared to you lot engineers. I feel like, you know, So silly. I was following it, but my hearing's quite bad, so I didn't get it all. But no, thanks Sarah for her talk and things, and I'll see you in a few days' time, I think, can't I?
Certainly. Okay, thank you. And has anybody else got any questions, any comments?
Fascinating, thank you. I think it's interesting when you put it in the context that she was growing up in the 1920s, because that was the era my grandma got married and she had to leave work when she got married. You know, that's the sort of way that women were treated at the time. And for her to break through into a man's world is, you know, you put it into context, it's even more inspiring.
Yes,
yeah,
definitely.
I think that's something, sorry, Helen.
I was just saying, yes, definitely. And the amount of women, you know, it was required of them to leave work as soon as they were married. And it's only in the last, I suppose, 50 years that that's not been the case. Women weren't allowed to work at night either.
Yeah, that's something that Beatrice was involved in. I think it was the fact that she went to work at night for Margaret Partridge that induced, you know, that kind of encouraged them to kind of look at that, removing those restrictions. Yeah, that article from 69 is really interesting because obviously she carried on working when she married George. So I think one of the things she talks about is the Air Ministry, I think, was a bit more used to employing women. So they were, I think it would be worth kind of researching this a bit more if anybody knows about it as well, you know, that they actually had slightly more perhaps liberal attitudes. And she didn't have to give up her job when she married George. So she did use her married name, Beatrice Naylor, in things like applying for the IMechE and stuff like that. And she carried on working. But whether that was kind of unique to the RAE, I don't know. Joanna Weber never got married. I don't think Frances Bradfield did either. So it was something we could probably research, Helen, if we wanted to look at.
Yeah, I think it's like I say, it goes back to motivations and opportunities, and so many of our WES engineers either didn't marry or you lose track of them completely because they did get married. Yeah, and it's about motivations and how, you know, back to this balancing life and work, and whether you can be married, be a mother and whatever, and have a professional career. And I think that's what a lot of these women encountered, and some of them chose just to stay to their professional careers. So yeah.
Oh, Helen, just one question, because I haven't checked this morning. Are there resources on the website that people can go to? I know you've got the centenary map. Do you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, we've got the centenary map, which pinpoints women across, well, it's across the world now. It was originally supposed to be just the UK because it was a national lottery project. And all of the pin drops on that map, which can be found on wes.org.uk, should link through to either Wikipedia pages or at least Wikidata pages, so you can find out more about women engineers. And they're not just WES women now, they are wider than that. So there's that. Our actual website is in the process of being reviewed, so anything that is on there now may not be there in a couple of weeks' time. So I don't want to say, oh, go there and you can find all this fantastic stuff. There is a lot of stuff on there. There's a lot of heritage stuff on there if you're interested in the history side of things. Obviously, if you're interested in it from the engineering side of it and you are an engineer, then contact our membership officer, Tristan, or membership manager, Tristan Holland. Or if you've got an organisation that's an engineering firm that you think needs to employ more women, then get in touch with our partners, partner managers, and they'll be able to signpost your organisation into supporting women in engineering. So thank you for that reminder there, Sarah. Right then, if nobody else has got anything they'd like to say, I'd just like to say thank you all for joining us today, and also to Sarah, thank you very much for your time. It's been great, and thank you, and I will log off and say goodbye to everybody. I hope to see you at some other sessions as well. Thank you.
Thanks all for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.